Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest in this edition is retired U.S. Navy Master Chief Petty Officer Edward Byers. He served nearly 2 decades as a Navy SEAL and received the Medal of Honor for his actions in Afghanistan in December 2012. Edward Byers was born and raised in Ohio. There had not been a strong military legacy in his family, but he became fascinated by the military, and Navy SEALs in particular, through popular culture.
There was no definitive reason why I joined. Gotcha. It was because the movies like Navy SEALs had just come out, books about SEALs in Vietnam had started coming out, and it was just fascinating. It was really cool technology. I wasn't allowed to own a gun growing up. I never hunted growing up. And so watching this stuff, though, as a young man on TV and reading these books, it was just fascinating to me. I think that was the catalyst.
Byers enjoyed a largely unstructured childhood, so joining the military brought some major adjustments for him. But perhaps his best early decision in the military was to listen to his mother.
In the beginning, so I first joined, I became a Navy corpsman at the advice of my mother, who said you should do something that you can use in the civilian world in case this military, venture does not work out for you. And so I actually took her advice, and that's how I became a Navy corpsman. But the Navy corpsman rating was closed off to SEALs, so I ended up, at the advice of some of my peers, ended up volunteering to go with the Marine Corps. So I became a Navy doc with a grunt unit, 2-2 Golf Company. And I will say that that is when I had my first dose of reality of becoming a professional soldier or sailor, because it was much different than the lifestyle that I had grown up with. Very regimented. It was there was no talking back. It was you do what I say, you don't question it, you're a junior ranking member, and that's just the way things had worked out. And so I quickly had to adapt to the environment to become successful.
As a newly minted Navy corpsman, Byers' first deployment took him to the Middle East around the time of a major terrorist event. Despite the bombing of the USS Cole, Byers says terrorism really didn't get discussed much on that assignment.
My first deployment with the Marines was in 2000, and it was with the 26th MEU. It was my first deployment of my military career, and it was the deployment in which the USS Cole was blown up, and we were doing gator circles basically off the coast of Israel, trying to understand what it is we were going to do from a Marine Corps perspective and a show of force. We didn't know what had happened, and I had no idea about terrorism or Al-Qaeda even at that point in history or life. It was just not something we discussed. It was more big military movement components, helping out host nation or partner nation forces and doing any sort of humanitarian aid aspects, which is a lot of what Navy and Marine, embarked Marine forces do on deployments around the world. But we had not any insight into terrorism at that point.
Not long after that deployment, Byers decided to pursue his long-standing dream of becoming a Navy SEAL. And he vividly remembers getting the news that he was invited to Bud's training.
About 2 weeks later, we had moved out into the field on base for some preparation for potential deployment training. And it was a scene that I had envisioned watching like Band of Brothers. We had just got done doing this 20-mile forced march ruck into the field, and I was working on one of my Marines' feet, fixing their blisters, and I hear this voice calling out, going, "Doc Byers, Doc Byers, Doc Byers." And, we're very aggressive, at that age, I'm, scream out like, "What do you want? I'm over here." And it comes up, and he was a guy delivering mail. And it was a scene like out of that you see like out of, like I said, Band of Brothers. And he hands me this piece of mail. And so I finish up my Marine's feet, I open it up, and it was my request sheet that was approved to attend Buds. And so this was right after 9/11. And it was shortly after that, a couple months later, I got my official orders, packed up our bags, and we moved all the way to San Diego to start my training.
BUDS, or SEAL training, is the most intense anywhere in the world. And if that weren't enough, Byers and his class arrived in Coronado, California shortly after 9/11, knowing that they were preparing to go to war. He says what followed was unlike anything else he ever experienced.
There is no way to describe what BUDS is like. You are cold, wet, sandy, and miserable for 8 months to 9 months. And that's if you make it all the way through without getting injured or getting rolled back. We started off with 200 people plus in our class. We came out of Hell Week with a very large number of people. I think it was well in near like 90 people. And we graduated with only, I think, 23 or 24 original members of our class. So it was a 90% reduction. I happened to be one of those original members. So the psychological impacts and the physical impacts of that are second to none. I fractured my tailbone a couple days before Hell Week started, so I went through Hell Week with a fractured tailbone. I wasn't able to do sit-ups or anything like that. I was colder than I've ever been in my life, even despite the fact that it was towards the end of the summer when we were going through our training. And there were times when you have a come to Jesus moment and go, can you physically make it through this type of stuff? And I really have to say that every time I got to that point in training where can I keep going is when I reflected back on my faith, and I would say a prayer and I said, give me a sign that this is something I'm supposed to be doing or that I can continue. And I have to say there was a couple times when I specifically made that request that within a matter of just 15, 20 seconds, we got the call from instructors to take a extended break because they knew they were pushing our class to the limit, and it was within the time that they needed to give us a break to recover. And that is really what kept us going, because not only was it physically draining, you have your own mental internal thoughts to it. 9/11 had just happened, and so the instructors were trying to create an environment that was unforgiving. And so the verbal components to it that come from the instructor side just made you think that you were the lowest piece of thing in the world and that you didn't matter at all. And so to wrestle with your internal thoughts, and then as a class, from an instructor perspective, you're thinking that they hate you to the nth degree. And then the physical requirements as they get tougher and tougher throughout training is just something that makes that training extremely unique and helps prepare you for the long-term aspects of continued war and the resiliency component behind it. Because ultimately, the takeaway is BUDS is not the hardest thing in the world. The hardest thing in the world is to say, I want to do this lifestyle for the next 20 years. The 300 days away from home, the dozen deployments to war zones, watching, friends die and teammates die and all the trials and tribulations that happen with that. And so that's the closest thing they can do to mimic the effects of warfare. And that part there is what I really am grateful for, because it embedded the commitment and the desire and the resiliency components that I would need to do throughout the rest of my career.
BUDS training lasts several months, and it tests every ounce of your physical, mental, and emotional strength. But for Byers, as grueling as the test was, that just made completing the challenge that much sweeter.
My biggest sense of pride and joy, I think, really came at the end of Hell Week, because that was the culmination of my entire upbringing of wanting to become a SEAL and knowing that was at least in my mind, the hurdle that was going to have to, can you make it through Hell Week? It's 5.5 days. We had 3 hours of sleep. You run well over 100 miles with boats and telephone poles, and it's pure exhaustion. You don't sleep for the first, 3 days. That right there it's really hard, processing that. So there's a video that I still have, fortunately, back in the day when there was really no video because we didn't have cell phones, of the commanding officer coming over the berm, which is in Coronado, is where the base is, and with the American flag and securing our Hell Week class on Friday morning. And after he got done saying your class is secured, something happened, and I'm the only person that did this, that just let out this roar. And the roar probably lasted 10 plus seconds, and the entire class is turning their heads, looking at me. And I was so proud in that moment, because I was a kid from small town America that had no insight into what the military was, and Navy SEALs are at the top echelon of our military units, and BUDS is renowned for being the hardest training in the military. And I just accomplished something that I would say, outside of a handful of people in my life, nobody thought I could do.
In just a moment, Edward Byers takes us on his first 2 SEAL deployments to Iraq, and the moment that steered him in a new direction. And later, Byers details his actions in Afghanistan that resulted in him receiving the Medal of Honor. Our guest is retired Master Chief Petty Officer Edward Byers. I'm Greg Corumbus, and this is Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus. Our guest this week is retired Navy SEAL and Medal of Honor recipient Edward Byers. After completing his many months of SEAL training, Byers and his SEAL team were sent to Operation Iraqi Freedom. But the deployment was not what he expected when he became a SEAL.
So our first deployment with SEAL Team 4 was to Baghdad, Iraq, and it was right after, this is 2005, and what had started to take place was we already had the Battle of Fallujah, which is, Fallujah is not that far from Baghdad, I believe the year prior. And we had picked up the responsibility of being the Protective Service Detail, or the PSD units, for the interim government of Iraq. And so my first half of the deployment was spent being on the Deputy Prime Minister's Protective Service Detail. And about halfway through our deployment, the U.S. government, for some reason, decided to drop his Protective Service Detail, and we then shifted over to Baghdad International Airport to start doing direct action missions in and around Baghdad, and mainly in Sadr City. And this was really the rise of that militia group, and was known at the time as the most dangerous place in the world. And so we started doing direct action missions in and around there till the end of our deployment. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, and we did a lot of missions, and we arrested a lot of people, but we didn't remove anyone off the battlefield, which was a very strange thing coming off of that deployment, of going, okay, I've read about Navy SEALs in combat, especially from Vietnam, and the impact that they had, which was massive for how small their unit size was. And here I was, I just spent nearly 7 months in Baghdad, operating in the most dangerous city in the world, and I went through an entire deployment without ever firing my rifle.
But Byers is quick to add that the security work he and his team did for the Iraqi government was critically important. And while it's not what he expected to be doing, he's proud of the work that was done.
This was our first deployment, and there was a lot of things that were new to us. We had a very dynamic deployment. One, it was a very much a proud sense of the fact that we were doing protective service detail for the interim government of Iraq. So we were having strategic impact. Keeping these people alive meant everything to the U.S. government. So as we were moving our detail around inside the green zone and then out into various parts around the country, we flew all around the country with our principal. That was very much a sense of pride, and the fact that nothing ever happened to him meant that we did our job correctly.
For his second SEAL deployment, Byers was once again in Iraq. Late in that assignment, he and other members of his team were sent to western Iraq. And it was there, through the pain of losing a close friend, that Byers realized the next goal he wanted to pursue.
Our second deployment ended up coming pretty quick in our minds. We had went through another workup, and now this time, though, we had deployed back to, in late 2006, deployed back to Fallujah and another place called Habaniya. And what we were doing out of there was now training host nation forces and also doing direct action missions. About halfway through that deployment, I got asked with a couple other of my teammates to move out to western Iraq near the Syria border called Rawa, and we helped stand up a base out there that was a Marine Corps base. What had happened on that deployment was the thing that was an action that changed the course of my life. Clark Schwedler, Petty Officer First Class Clark Schwedler, was doing a direct action mission outside of Fallujah when he was fatally wounded. And Clark was one of my very close friends and teammates. And that drove the catalyst for me wanting to try out for Naval Special Warfare Development Group, which is commonly referred to as SEAL Team 6. And so that was in April of 2007, right at the very tail end of our deployment. It was also the mission in which Mike Day, who was the chief petty officer at the time, was shot 27 times and ended up walking to the helicopter. And it just showed you sometimes, the tides of war. You can get shot one time or shot a couple dozen times, and you may or may not live, depending on what God has in store for you. But Clark's death drove me to want to try out for Dev Group, and it was really the turning point in my career within Naval Special Warfare as a Navy SEAL.
Our guest is U.S. Navy retired Master Chief Petty Officer Edward Byers. He served 2 decades as a Navy SEAL and received the Medal of Honor for his actions in Afghanistan in December 2012. When we come back, Byers takes us step by step on that harrowing mission that changed his life. And he talks about the painful memories that will stay with him forever from that mission. I'm Greg Corumbus, and this is Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus. Our guest in this edition is retired U.S. Navy Master Chief Petty Officer Edward Byers. He served as a Navy SEAL and received the Medal of Honor for his service in Afghanistan from December 2012. Before walking us through the events of that fateful day, Byers says it's important to remember the context. By now he was on SEAL Team 6, and just a year earlier, he had played, in his words, a small role in the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. But the reason he was where he was in December 2012 was because of horrific losses that Special Operations suffered in the summer of 2011.
And then just a handful of months later, on August 6, 2011, we had the downing of Extortion 17. And the downing of Extortion 17 ended up becoming the greatest single loss of life in Special Operations history. We lost 30 Americans and a military working dog. And in an eerie nod to the call sign of that helicopter, we lost 17 SEALs. And so in an instant, a third of one of our units was lost. What ended up happening out of that was they had to reconstitute the loss of what was known as 2 Troop from Gold Squadron. And so they decided to pull individuals from other squadrons to reconstitute this lost troop. I had the honor and privilege of being one of those men, and I came over from Blue Squadron to make up the new 2 Troop.
Byers now shares the mission he and his team were assigned on December 8, 2012, and he takes us moment by moment through the intense effort to save an American life.
Well, in early December, we started to get intelligence reporting that an American doctor had been taken captive. He was going over to do a Doctors Without Borders thing and had linked up with a few other Afghan doctors, and then come to find out they had turned on him, and then they turned him over to the Taliban, who then took him captive, and was more than likely was going to use Dr. Joseph as a bargaining pawn to help release some captive combatants that the U.S. had. Well, how our mission came about so quickly was we started to get intelligence reportings that he was going to get moved over to Pakistan. And typically when that happens, you're almost for sure going to lose contact with that person, and then the survival rate is going to drastically start decreasing as time goes on. And so our unit spun up on this target. We developed the intelligence picture as fast as possible, and on the night of December 8th, we launched out of our base and landed about 5 hours away and started patrolling into the target. Now, what we did differently, and it was again a nod back to our SEAL brethren in Vietnam and how they used to attack targets going through the Mekong Delta, the hardest way into the targets. We took on the same approach because the way our target building was positioned and where we thought the doctor was being held captive was in a compound that overlooked the entire valley. So there was no way to walk up the front, up the valley to the compound, because despite it being at night and with even low lume, once your eyes adjust, you can see across the valley, plain as day, especially with as many people as we had and trying to move those type of forces. But this compound was to the back, it was butted up right to the back, the bottom of a mountainside. And so we came up the backside to that mountain and then had to walk down the face of that mountain. What we didn't know was, because there's only so much you can get from looking at and doing route reconnaissance, was how steep it actually was. And there was points where our team was turned around bouldering down the side of the mountain and using our ladders to get down from level to level to level. There was no clear path to do that. And so it really cut into our time. When we all finally got down to the bottom of the mountain and we got to our set point, we started to hear calls of prayer throughout the valley, and off in the very distance, started to see the sun started to peak up, first light. And so we knew we were right on the cusp. No more time to waste. It was at that moment that Nick Check, our point man, started to lead out our patrol and started moving towards the target building, our area of responsibility. Now, we were there with our entire troop, and the compound had many buildings and many places that needed to be hit simultaneously. So our team started to fan out and started taking their areas of responsibility. Our specific team, Echo Team, which was being led out by Nick Check, moved to our target building, and that we had assessed is where the Dr. Joseph was being held. And so as we started to get closer to the building, one of the Taliban guards had come out of the door with his rifle, and Nick Check immediately engaged him, and that started the catalyst of us rapidly accelerating our prosecution of the target. Nick took shots at him and began sprinting and moved in such a fashion that by the time I had a chance to react and started to maneuver to gain some space between us in case I had to also shoot, he was already 6 to 8 feet ahead of me. It was an instantaneous shots on target to forward progression to the door to prosecute this building. When we got to the building, which was only 20 to 30 feet away at this time, the door, we encountered something we had never encountered before on all of the prior years of doing combat operations. It was wool blankets that was multi-layered and cemented into the door frame on opposing sides. And so shots had already been fired, and in a hostage rescue mission, we had to move, because if they woke up and decided to execute the American hostage, it is mission failure, and we did not do what it is we're designed to do as a military unit. And one of our first mission essential task lists is to do hostage rescue. And so a couple of us hopped on these blankets to try to rip them out of the door seam, and they were cemented in so well they couldn't do it. And it was, even after a couple seconds, we heard a voice from our troop chief who said, "Get the hell inside there. Let's go." We were talking about matters of seconds here. There wasn't a long delay in time, but seconds were hours in this environment right now. And so as Nick started to weave his way through, there was more gunshots. You can't really see what was happening because you were having to push away multi-layers of blankets, these heavy wool, blankets. And it's very difficult too, because it's getting hung up on your gear, your guns, your night vision, all that stuff. I moved in right behind Nick, and I had stepped over something or someone, moved into my area of responsibility, which was to the left. And as I came in and presented my weapon, I saw somebody that was about 20 feet away from me also starting to present a weapon towards me, and I was able to engage him and make some very clean shots in his head and dropped him right there. But it was a matter of just split seconds of him getting shots off on me versus the other way around. It was at that time that I noticed somebody scrambling across the floor that was moving towards those weapons, and by the time I was able to close with that person, I was able to lock them down on the ground, pinning them to the ground with my knees on their shoulders as I was adjusting my night vision to gain facial recognition. This entire time, this person is trying to reach for these weapons and grab something. And well, I didn't know if this was one of the hostages that was scared and was trying to move, because there was no voices at this time. There was nothing was being called out. And it was roughly in that instance that we began to call out for Dr. Joseph, like somebody, is he in this room? Will he say it? And there was no response. And this is all happening in just matters of seconds, right? So after a few more of these call-outs to Dr. Joseph, I finally hear this voice, I'm over here. And it was not the person I was on top of, and it was a voice that was coming from my right-hand side. And so I made the decision to shoot the person that I was on top of, and whether it killed him or subdued him enough, I was able to then jump off of that person, and I leapt across the room and was able to jump on Dr. Joseph, because there's still shots are now flying throughout this room. And so I jumped on Dr. Joseph to protect him with my body armor. It just happened to be, by the grace of God, that one of the other Taliban was within arm's reach of me. And I was able to hold Dr. Joseph against me with body armor, and within arm's reach, I was able to reach over and pin that person against the wall by their throat. And fortunately, what that had done was just given enough time for the rest of the team to make it inside and eliminate that threat. And so once that threat was eliminated, we went through doing the standard protocol of, asking him if he was hurt, ask him if he could, walk, ask him if they had been booby trapped. He didn't know if they put a suicide vest on him or if there was a, grenade that was set up ready for the pin pulled. So we did with a coordination with our EOD, an explosives check on him, make sure he was okay, and then we started to move him. We moved Dr. Joseph outside.
The team successfully rescued Dr. Joseph, but that operation came at a terrible price. Nick Check, whom Byers mentioned repeatedly in that account of the operation, was seriously wounded, and the desperate effort to save his life was soon underway.
When we had moved Dr. Joseph outside because we were coming on really quickly for first light and we needed to get extracted, I had looked over and I saw that people were working on Nick. And so I had asked for a replacement to take over from security detail on Dr. Joseph, and I started going over and working on Nick and helping our Air Force pararescuemen and started to do a head-to-toe assessment on Nick and begin to see what we could do to potentially save his life. After the helicopters landed, we quickly got on board and they took off, and for the next 40 minutes on our way back to Bagram, we treated Nick's wounds. We did interosseous or IO device IVs and started CPR on him, which we rotated through the entire flight. And it was at that time when we got to the cache, the military hospital on base, that the doctors, pronounced him dead on the scene. Unfortunately, Nick was succumbed to, he was shot in the head, and there was really not much we could do for him. But we knew if there was any chance, we owed him that.
Byers sees the Medal of Honor as a blessing and a burden. He loves having a lifetime of opportunities to talk about why he loves this country and the values that make us great. But he says it does require many days away from home after a military career that also kept him away from his family. But Byers says he also wears the medal in honor of those on his teams and his friends who were lost on the battlefield.
But as I talked about in the past, and how I view being a recipient at the end of the day, and I'm just a holder of this medal, and while it's for my personal actions, it is really, they would never have been able, I would have never been able to do what I've done if it wasn't for my entire team as a whole and how we operated. Nick was an absolute warrior, and he was fearless. And he showed that night in his immediate actions and his aggression to go save an American doctor. And it really is an ode back to Clark Schwedler from 2007 to the men of Extortion 17, which is how I ended up on Gold Squadron, in their passing, and just a year prior in 2011, and then with Nick Check. So every time I pick up this medal, I think about those three tragic incidences and all the lives of the warriors that were lost, that went into me being there on that night, and then subsequently being awarded this medal.
Retired U.S. Navy Master Chief Petty Officer Edward Byers. He served nearly 2 decades as a Navy SEAL, and he's a recipient of the Medal of Honor. I'm Greg Corumbus, and this is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corumbus, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit americanveteranscenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features. And of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.